A confession closed the case. The evidence didn't. Angie Dodge, Christopher Tapp. Chronicles of Clues. In 1996, investigators collected a piece of evidence they believe would solve a murder. They carefully labeled it. They sealed it. They logged it into storage. Then it disappeared into a vault. For more than 20 years, it sat in silence. And while a man went to prison, it waited. On June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found murdered in her apartment in Idaho Falls, Idaho. It was the kind of crime that fractures a community. Angie was young. She was known. She had a future. By morning, that future was gone. Inside the apartment, the bedroom told a story of violence. The bed was pushed off alignment. Sheets were twisted. Objects were knocked out of place. There were unmistakable signs of a struggle. Investigators believed she had fought, and they believed her attacker had left something behind. For a town the size of Idaho Falls, fear spread quickly. Parents locked their doors earlier. Rumors traveled faster than facts. And police felt the pressure mounting. The public wanted reassurance. They wanted resolution. They wanted someone responsible. And in cases like this, the clock doesn't just tick. It echoes. Among the items collected at the scene was biological material, critical forensic evidence. In the mid-1990s, DNA testing was still in its technological adolescence. It had already proven powerful in exonerating the innocent and convicting the guilty. But the science wasn't yet what it would become. Testing required larger samples. Results took longer. Databases were limited. Still, investigators believed the evidence would speak clearly. When the DNA profile was developed, it did speak, just not in the way investigators expected. It did not match anyone in the existing criminal database. There was no immediate suspect, no direct hit, and that silence began to feel dangerous. Because when evidence doesn't give answers, investigators often start looking elsewhere. Weeks passed, then months. Leads dried up. Attention shifted. Investigators began focusing on a 20-year-old local man named Christopher Tapp. Tapp was not a violent offender. He had no known connection to Angie Dodge. He had no physical evidence tying him to the crime. No DNA match. No fingerprints. No witnesses placing him at the scene. But investigators believe he might know something. And belief can be powerful. Christopher Tapp was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied involvement. He denied knowing anything about the murder. But the interrogations did not stop. They extended for hours. Then days. Sessions were recorded. And what unfolded inside those interrogation rooms would later become central to the case. Investigators suggested possibilities. They proposed timelines. They corrected inconsistencies. They told Tapp they already knew what happened. They implied others had implicated him. They told him honesty would help. Gradually, something changed. Christopher Tapp began to doubt himself. He began speculating, then agreeing, then revising. Eventually, he confessed. But here's the twist. The confession didn't match the evidence. Details shifted between interviews. Descriptions contradicted forensic findings. Key facts were wrong. Investigators would guide him. He would adjust. They would challenge him. He would correct himself again. The narrative evolved, not from memory, but from suggestion. Yet to investigators under pressure, it felt like progress. And to a community desperate for closure, It felt like justice. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of Angie Dodge's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The case appeared closed. Headlines moved on. But something didn't fit. Because throughout the entire investigation, one fact remained unchanged. The DNA collected from the crime scene did not match Christopher Tapp. Not partially. Not closely. It simply wasn't his. That fact wasn't hidden. It was known. But investigators theorized the DNA might belong to another participant. They suggested Tapp wasn't alone. They believed the confession outweighed the contradiction. And so the biological evidence, the most objective voice in the room, was placed back into storage. The file was archived. And Christopher Tapp entered prison. Years passed. Technology advanced. And outside the walls of that prison, science evolved. By the early 2000s, DNA testing methods became more refined. Smaller samples could be analyzed. Results became more precise. By the 2010s, a revolutionary technique emerged: genetic genealogy. It had already been used in cold cases. It worked differently from traditional database matching. Instead of requiring a direct match to a known offender, genetic genealogy looked for relatives, distant cousins, shared ancestry, fragments of family trees. From there, investigators could narrow down suspects who had never been in a criminal database. It was a breakthrough. And in Angie Dodge's case, that preserved evidence still existed and touched. Waiting. But here's another twist. The push to re-examine the DNA didn't come from the police. It came from Angie's own mother. Carol Dodge never believed Christopher Tapp acted alone. And over time, she began to question whether he was involved at all. She reviewed interrogation tapes. She studied transcripts. She saw inconsistencies others had overlooked. And she became an unlikely advocate for the very man convicted of killing her daughter. Imagine that. A victim's mother pushing to retest evidence, not to reinforce the conviction, but to question it. Carol Dodge believed the truth still existed in that preserved DNA sample. She believed science could answer what pressure could not. Her persistence mattered. Because in 2017, the DNA was reanalyzed using modern methods. The results were definitive. The DNA did not belong to Christopher Tapp. And this time, investigators could no longer ignore it. After more than 20 years behind bars, Christopher Tapp was exonerated. He walked out of prison a free man. But freedom, after 2 decades, comes at a cost. He had lost his 20s, his 30s, most of his adult life. And the real killer had never been held accountable. The story could have ended there. An exoneration. A tragic mistake. A cautionary tale. But the evidence still had more to say. Using genetic genealogy, investigators traced the unknown DNA profile through distant relatives. Family trees were built. Connections narrowed. Names surfaced. Eventually, the search led to a man named Brian Dripps. Dripps had lived across the street from Angie Dodge at the time of the murder. He had never been a primary suspect. He had never been meaningfully investigated. And his DNA had never been compared. When tested, the match was exact. Brian Dripps confessed. More than 2 decades after the crime. The same evidence. To completely different outcomes. The truth had not changed. The science had not changed the evidence. It changed the ability to interpret it. So, what went wrong in 1996? Was it bad faith? Corruption? Or something more human? Research into false confessions reveals uncomfortable truths. Under prolonged interrogation, individuals can internalize suggested narratives, especially when isolated, especially when convinced that confessing will bring relief. Christopher Tapp's interrogations contained repeated suggestions, repeated correction, repeated reinforcement. What sounded like inside knowledge may have been information fed, intentionally or unintentionally, during questioning. And once a confession exists, it becomes powerful. Jurors trust it. Communities accept it. Investigators anchor to it. Contradictory evidence begins to feel like an obstacle rather than a guide. The DNA didn't fail. It was sidelined. Because humans are not purely logical. We are influenced by urgency, by expectation, by the need for resolution. There's something haunting about this case. Not just that an innocent man lost to decades. Not just that a family waited 20 years for the right answer. But that the solution was present from the beginning. It sat in a sealed container. Unchanged. The most important clue in the room was also the quietest. And for years, no one listened. Christopher Tapp later received compensation for his wrongful conviction. But compensation cannot restore time. It cannot restore the ordinary milestones of adulthood. Meanwhile, Carol Dodge, a mother who endured unimaginable loss, ultimately helped correct a miscarriage of justice. Her determination reframed the narrative. This wasn't just a story about wrongful conviction. It became a story about persistence, about science catching up, about humility. Because justice is not just about catching someone. It's about catching the right someone. There's one final detail that lingers. When Brian Dripps confessed, he had acted alone. There was no accomplice, which means the original theory, the one used to justify the DNA mismatch, was wrong. Not partially wrong. Completely wrong. For more than 20 years, a narrative built on pressure and assumption overshadowed physical truth. The evidence never changed. The interpretation did. So, what do we take from this? Confessions feel definitive. DNA feels clinical. But when the two conflict, one must be questioned. In this case, it wasn't. Until it was. And by then, decades had passed. The lesson isn't that science is perfect. It's that evidence deserves patience. Because sometimes the loudest answer is not the correct one. Sometimes the quietest clue carries the most weight. In 1996, investigators believed they had solved a murder. In 1998, a jury believed they had convicted the right man. For 20 years, the public believed justice had been served. But justice is not a belief. It's a process. And sometimes that process takes longer than we're comfortable admitting. The DNA waited. It did not fade. It did not weaken. It simply remained. And when the world was finally ready to listen, it spoke. This has been Chronicles of Clues, where the evidence never disappears, it only waits.